as we were finishing up, I said just a few words on genetic resources on the high seas and the issue of access and benefit sharing for genetic resources on the high seas remained a somewhat open and controversial question, and there has been substantial progress with an agreement on kind of the basic parameters, but on the issue of whether or not there will be sharing of the revenues and resources that arise out of exploitation continues to not be settled at the moment. And of course, this depends quite a bit on, it is an expected thing that the countries that do not have the capacity to exploit will want to share in the revenues from those who do have the capacity to exploit. So we could almost assume that that would be true before we even ask the question. The question is whether the countries with the capacity to exploit will agree to share the resources with those who do not have the capacity to exploit. So we will naturally see what happens with that. I imagine it will be a period of years before that is all becomes a little more solid. I would also just note, as kind of a current events matter, that towards the end of the talk yesterday, I was talking about the outstanding issue in the pandemic agreement, which has to do, again, with access and benefit sharing of pandemic virus, both materials and digital information. And in fact, just yesterday, that kind of remaining negotiation on the pandemic agreement just started again in Geneva. So I don't have anything to tell you about the outcome of that, but perhaps within the next week or two, we'll see what the progress is on that. But I mean, again, you have a big question about the buy-in or the acceptance by the countries that actually produce or are in a better position to produce and develop the resources. And again, not so dissimilar from the seabed and high seas resources negotiation, it is natural or expected that the countries without the capacity will be wanting an agreement on sharing, and the question is to what extent the countries with the capacity will want to be sharing. So that's a natural way that things need to get resolved. And again, to just go back, a big issue now with the WHO just has to do with the financing of the organization, with the United States, which was the biggest financer, having announced its withdrawal, and the European Union not contributing very much more. So you have some real financial issues taking place in these international organizations, and those remain to be resolved. So I'm going to leave that there. That basically is the conclusion of yesterday's talk, and of course we can go back and any questions or comments you might want to make. You're free to raise them at any time. So today we're turning to quantum computing, and so let me just say at the outset, with biotechnology and even AI, for me personally, these are fields I've been involved in terms of software and biotechnology and pharmaceuticals for many years, and have a pretty good understanding of the science and can explain that to you. When we get to quantum mechanics and quantum computing, we're in a very different area where perhaps we can understand the words, but it doesn't necessarily mean we really have a good grasp of the concepts. And just by way of general background and a flavor of this, as you're probably aware, Albert Einstein, who was mentioned yesterday. So you have this question, which we'll come back to in a minute, whether quantum mechanics is right in describing the entanglement of particles and the general idea that the state of a particle is determined by observation, that the particle may not assume its actual state until someone is observing it, and that the observation can be done not only directly but from a distance. Albert Einstein spent the later part of his career challenging this notion that you have what he referred to as spooky action at a distance. He just wasn't wanting to accept that. The scientific community, the quantum mechanics scientists and physics, believe that they then have established the actual reality of, we'll call it spooky action at a distance, or what they refer to as entanglement. Both entanglement and that the idea that observation will determine the state of a thing, right? That it doesn't reveal its state until it is looked at. This is very counterintuitive, right? And this, again, it's difficult a little bit in the English, but you're probably familiar. This was the idea with Schrodinger and the Schrodinger cat idea, that he said, well, let's imagine you have a box and you put a cat in the box, and you have a device in the box with an electrical charge, and the cat may or may not hit a switch on the device which will kill the cat. We don't actually know whether the cat is alive or dead until we open the box. And so from our standpoint, the aliveness or the deadness of the cat is determined by our observation, and we do not know until we open the box. Now, Schrodinger said he kind of said that as a joke. He wanted to explain that the idea was a little bit absurd, right? Because obviously either the cat was alive or dead, and opening the box or not wasn't going to determine whether the cat was alive or dead. But that has become the famous description of this idea that the position of particles or the state of matter may not actually be determined until we observe it. And it's this quantum mechanical idea that is at the basis of quantum computing. And so, we'll come back to this, but so the first idea is this idea of entanglement. That is that particles know each other's state, regardless of how far away they are. They could be at other sides of the universe. And the position of a particle in one place could be affected by the observation of the particle in another place, and the other place could be in a distant quasar. So they've actually done experiments with that now, right? And think they've demonstrated that that is accurate. And this other idea is this idea of superposition, that the particle can simultaneously be in many different states at the same time. Now, so again, I don't want to dwell on history or your experience too much, but if I go back to the 1980s and what when microprocessors were first becoming kind of a popular idea, one of my earliest clients in Silicon Valley was one of these microprocessor manufacturers, and again, as lawyers, what you'll find in the course of your experience, when you represent a client, you pretty much have to understand their technology, because if you don't understand their technology, you can't draft an agreement that exchanges their technology and gets involved in it. And so what I would say is, looked at from the standpoint of the difference between quantum mechanics, describing how a conventional microprocessor works is a relatively straightforward matter. They're based on basically what is a transistor which creates what's called a gate, and whether the transistor is either on or off, and whether transistors are on or off depend on the level of electrical charge going to the transistor, and microprocessors are built around millions of these gates and digital bits, which then are either in an on or off position, and then they're formed into bytes, and you have bits and bytes, and you have a great deal of information that can be flowing into a microprocessor at the same time. I won't try to describe that process, but so you'll see you have, you started with 8-bit microprocessors, then you went to 16-bit, then 32-bit, and today most of the microprocessors are 64-bit. There's some 128-bit microprocessors, but that's determined by how many transistors or gates there are in the microprocessor, which also determines how much information can be processed at the same time. And so the more capacity it has, the faster the microprocessor is. But it's all involved with this system in which individual transistors are either in an on or off state. So, billions of times a second, you're asking a series of little transistors whether they should be on or off, and mathematically aggregating the output of that decision-making structure, you end up with an output from the computer. That may be the world's worst description of how a microprocessor works, but feel free to read about it at your own convenience. The point is, though, that we can understand that. I mean, the basic idea of a transistor and aggregating transistors and creating binary code and switching them on and off, and having that on and off switching determines how a formula is calculated, is something that the human mind says, okay, I understand that, however well you're understanding it. When you get to quantum mechanics and quantum computing, it is what we'll call counterintuitive. The human mind wasn't built to think that everything in reality is in an indeterminate state, and that reality doesn't become reality until we look at it, and then determining how that reality is determined, a qubit or a quantum gate can give you an answer to a question, and instead of the transistor or the traditional gate, you have something called a qubit, and the number of qubits that are in the processor determines how much information it can process at the same time. But I think maybe the key is that the traditional microprocessor is limited to answering the question yes or no. So it may answer the question yes or no a billion times a second, but it's answering yes or no. Whereas the qubit can say yes, yes plus, yes plus plus, yes plus plus plus, yes plus 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 plus, and go on almost infinitely in a series of different states rather than on off. It's an almost infinite number of possibilities to answer a combinatorial question, and so we're told that allows the quantum processor to solve much more complicated questions than a traditional microprocessor can. And so then you read illustrations of quantum computers, at least in principle, and they've done early work on that, being able to solve a problem that a traditional computer would take 1 million years to solve, and solving it in 12 minutes, right? Because of the vast difference in computational power and what that will do. Now, to be clear, this is at a very early stage, right? What these things can actually do today. So you have a lot of investment, tremendous amount of investment, billions and billions of US dollars or however many RMB you want to translate that in, going to investing in building these quantum systems, and they're being built in China, and they're being built in the United States. They're being built in Europe, but the who can build this is really limited to companies and governments that have vast resources, because these things are very expensive and very challenging to build and operate in very difficult states. And so we'll look at this a little bit more. But as I was mentioning yesterday in relation to the question about cryptocurrency, one of the issues that people are looking forward to, and it's not only cryptocurrency is just one area, that these computers will be so powerful that today's encryption standards, the way you protect data, simply won't be able to withstand attacks by these quantum computers, because the quantum computers will be able to solve the problems of the cryptographic keys in ways that traditional computers are unable to do that. So that's one of the big challenges in this area. So other challenges you face is that these quantum systems work at close to absolute zero temperatures. They're very sensitive to environmental conditions. They can only be used in isolated rooms and very highly controlled environments. So you can't bump one of them or it will stop working. And if you don't keep the temperature accurate, it won't work. And also one of the biggest issues, again, the field is currently facing, is that apparently these qubits don't always give you the right answer. They have errors in the results. And so one of the largest efforts going on is improving the error correction capacity in these quantum computing systems. Now, when we look at this from an IP standpoint, a patent standpoint, an intellectual property standpoint, this whole thing presents, well, both a commonality and a challenge. So, because these are computing machines, they're physical hardware, they're wired in different ways, and they're working with different kinds of materials, but these are physical machines. The machine isn't an algorithm or an abstract idea, it's a machine. So we're very familiar with this idea of patented machine and how you describe a machine and the functionality. But, I mean, things, again, it's not such an uncommon challenge. The technology is advancing very quickly. So if you're trying to patent a new quantum computer, even for your own company, even if you're Google, even if you're Huawei, by the time you get the patent, you will probably have developed a new quantum computer. So if patents take 2 or 3 years to be granted, as the patent you got on your old quantum computer going to cover your new quantum computer, and how do you draft your patent so it not only covers
covers what you just made, but what you will be making in the second and third iteration of the same thing. So that's a challenge. The other thing is, and again, and I'll revert to this a bit, you have to enable it. You have to describe it. So that presents multiple challenges. First of all, and, I don't need to sound like a broken record, but quantum mechanics is very difficult to describe in language, right? It's very difficult to describe, and it's very difficult to understand. And so patent drafters have to figure out how you can actually describe this idea, and again, we'll call it indeterminacy, that things aren't fixed. How do you describe something that's not fixed in a patent application? And so how do you really explain this in the language that a patent applicant or a patent examiner could understand, number one. And then, again, I don't think, so the quantum computers do involve mathematics and software and algorithms. I mean, again, that's how they function. You need a piece of software to run your quantum computer, just as you need a piece of computer software to run your conventional computer. So you're also going to be filing with your application whatever operating system it is you're using to manage the quantum computer, and then you face the same challenge you face with other software, which is the software an idea? Is it some type of code? Is it some kind of flow chart? And how do you describe all that? So apparently you also have a real issue in quantum mechanics and quantum computing, is that a lot of the research is done and published in scientific journals by physicists who aren't necessarily thinking about the commercial applications of what they're doing, right? They're the Einsteins. They're the people who are trying to solve the riddle of what quantum mechanics is, and they're publishing academic papers with the results of their research. Well, that becomes prior art, right? And so then when you're filing a patent application, you have to find out or figure out whether there are these academic papers which have already described the invention that you're describing in your patent application. And again, the challenges of doing that. Now, you do have a lot of patents that are granted with respect to quantum computing. WIPO has, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has one or two papers on discussing the number of patents that have been granted in this area. There's quite a few who have been granted to IBM and Google. You also have a good number. The largest filers of patents with respect to quantum computing are from China. Alibaba, Baidu, Huawei are also investing a great deal in this area. So you have a lot of patent applications being filed by them. And I won't pretend that I can tell you what all of these things are, but these filings, from looking at the literature, refer to things called qubit modality, quantum gates and circuits, quantum processors, cryogenics, so that's the thing that keeps it cold, and control systems, quantum sensors, quantum algorithms for machine learning, optimization, and cryptography, error correction methods, and quantum classical hybrid algorithms. So that would just mean something, an algorithm that functions simultaneously on a classical computer system and a quantum system, and combining those two types of technologies. And this just, I gave you a slide on this. This just summarizes some of the particular areas that have been identified, prior art complexity, you have archives, and identifying what's truly novel in this landscape is difficult. Enablement, because of the counterintuitive nature of quantum mechanics, is difficult to satisfy, to allow a person to make it. The inventions are probabilistic and unpredictable. And so how do you describe something that is probabilistic? You know, the outcome is indeterminate, and the specialized knowledge needed for doing that. And again, going back to a very fundamental problem, the people at the leading edge of this research are the most advanced physicists in our society, right? The people who are just very good at high-level mathematics and understanding particle physics and indeterminacy and those things. And that's not something you can just go into any PhD program and say, I'd like a guy who can do this, right? There's very few people who can do this. And those people are getting paid a lot of money to do it. So then how do you hire them to be a patent examiner, right? Who may be making a few thousand RMB and whatever, and the company is willing to pay them millions for the same amount of time. And so you have to convince someone with a high-level understanding of quantum mechanics to come be a patent examiner and review these applications. This is a very serious problem, right? How do you know whether a patent application is valid? And it's very difficult to find someone who can understand whether it's valid. And then again, rapid obsolescence. The technology becomes obsolete very quickly. And so there's some foundational patents that we think might be valuable, but a lot of things are going to become obsolete very quickly. And so here's an observation that I made myself, which wasn't an act of genius, but then raising it with people involved in the field, my simple observation was this quantum mechanics is so challenging to understand that I'm not sure there's very many human beings that understand it. And the reaction I got was, well, you're really right about that. And the problem we confront is because human beings are designed to think about things in a particular way, that they have a lot of trouble, human beings, getting their minds around this idea that nothing is determinate and everything is uncertain until you observe it, and that these things are entangled and you're going to get a result that you weren't anticipating, and how does a human being process all that? And the answer that I got from the community was yes, because as I made the observation, again, you would make the same observation if you thought about it for a while. Maybe the only thing that will understand these quantum computers is AIs. That the math and the development is so challenging that human beings, except a very few, can't really understand how this works or explain how it works. But maybe AIs can do this. And the answer was, yes, that's correct. There's a widespread belief in the call it the scientific community that's working on this, that we're moving to a realm in which the only thing that can understand a quantum computer is an advanced AI. And so it will be the AIs that are doing the development of the quantum computers, because the AIs can solve the math problems without the predispositions that human beings come to with respect to those problems. And then it turns out that in fact, this is a big area of investment. So that if you look at Google and Huawei and Baidu and the companies working in this area, what they've been working on is essentially a merger of fields. That is, merging the AIs and the quantum computers, which leads you to the idea at some point that AIs and quantum computers are going to be creating these new intelligent entities that human beings really just can't follow. And that sounds like science fiction, but this is actually the reality. This is where money is being invested, that we may end up having these combinatorial systems which are really creating themselves. Well, what do you do with that if you're an IP lawyer? Well, pretty hard to say. We're going to have a lot of trouble keeping up with that. And I realize, just as I'm saying, that this all sounds very abstract and hypothetical, but if you look at where the billions and billions of dollars of investment money are going, it's going into this. And so, and then again, talking about what I'll call the merger of fields. Similarly, if you look at Google's DeepMind and, isomorphic and AlphaFold and, computational protein construction with AI, the theory is that quantum computers will also be able to solve the problems of identifying the best combinations between substances in the human body and substances that can be created by combinational biotechnology, and that the quantum computers will be able to help solve the problems of medicine and in this field. So all of the three things we've been discussing in here, that is AI, biotechnology, and quantum computing or quantum mechanics, end up as a joint enterprise where innovation will take place at this very sophisticated level, which, for lack of a better way of putting it, most of us aren't going to be able to understand. So this is what's going on, and then you would naturally ask the question: well, if you've got an AI and a quantum computer and a program for folding proteins all working together, what does that mean for intellectual property? What are you filing as a patent application? Is intellectual property relevant to that? Are you going to be able to describe some piece of knowledge or technology that should be protected? And how are you going to know if somebody's infringing it? And how are you going to litigate that? If you're combining all of these difficult areas and black box problems and so forth and doing litigation. So is intellectual property even going to end up being relevant to all this if it moves that quickly? And I can only raise that question. I really can't purport to answer it. If you have a lot of patents being filed, one of the areas we talk about that's problematic in the patent system is this idea of patent system, patent thickets we call it. A thicket is like you take a garden and you have a lot of weeds and that creates something that's difficult to get through, and that's called a thicket in English. And so once you have a lot of patents growing up like weeds, and someone wants to walk through the field, how does one walk through this field of patents if you have so many patents and so many things you need to
think about before you actually even try to invent something, because you don't know if someone's already invented it, so you'll be wasting your money because you'll be faced with an infringement lawsuit, and that's going to present new challenges. So, you know, practically we're only at the very beginning of this. Well, what I'll mention is, well, what is likely to happen in terms of industrial policy, right? If the companies and groups and governments that are creating this are all investing tremendous amounts of money, and it is extraordinarily expensive to build these systems and the quantum computers, we'll likely just end up with a very highly concentrated industry, right? Where we'll have 6 actors in this area, you know, 2 in China, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe, 1 in Latin America, that have the resources to compete in this area, because the amount of resources you need to operate are so large that the idea of a small company starting up and getting into the area may be quite difficult. So that will be a challenge. Certainly a lot of this, of what I've just talked about, is both difficult for all of us to understand and difficult for us to foresee the future, right? As I said, quantum computing, if you look at what's recently been going on in the major international stock markets, you'll see that investors are pouring a great deal of money into quantum computing companies because everybody reads quantum computing as the future, right? So let's invest in quantum computers. The interesting problem about that is no one really has a good quantum computer actually working yet. I mean, there are some that perform some limited computational functions, but it's not really a field where you have a large use case right now for these quantum computers, or that they're even working. But people believe that they will work. Well, if that many people believe it, maybe it's true, right? And I guess, again, just to comfort all of us who think, gee, does any of that make sense? I would just say that Albert Einstein spent most of the latter part of his life saying that doesn't make sense. And if it didn't make sense to Albert Einstein, I feel comfortable saying it doesn't make sense to me. But apparently there's quite a few people who believe it makes sense. So, for lack of a better way of putting it, we'll just have to accept that it makes sense to somebody. And that presumptively it tells us something about the future. Again, as I say, what this tells us about AI, I mean, intellectual property, that's more difficult to say. It might suggest that we'll be relying more on trade secret than patent companies just trying to keep the information within their own company and not distributing it, than they are actually relying on filing a patent and trying to define these things with claims and so forth. So NVIDIA is not in the quantum computing business in the sense of building quantum computers, although Jensen Huang has, of course, acknowledged that this is a big thing and that they are looking at it and thinking about the future. But at the moment, I think NVIDIA's view, from what I've heard him say, is that because, and we talked about these hybrid systems, that AIs are playing a big role in solving the mathematical problems involved in quantum computing, that the NVIDIA systems are working on the algorithms that can run on the quantum computers. But NVIDIA as such has not been a substantial actor in the quantum computing field. but obviously that's likely to change.
NVIDIA computer will not evolve into a quantum computer because the technology of the gates is a completely different thing. So NVIDIA is using the traditional type of, we'll call it transistor-based gate. You have different names for them. You know, in the old days it was N-channel and P-channel gates, and the terminology for that changes, and how they're designed, and how the semiconductor maps are designed and drawn and etched, right? You have a very sophisticated Dutch company, you know, manufacturing, now you use lasers for etching the silicon maps and so forth. So the technology in the conventional systems is very rapidly evolved and become much more sophisticated, but the two things are different in terms of the whole architecture. So one will not become the other. Well, there's a lot of controversy about how this technology is both changing society and changing the environment. On the environment side, already with traditional AI, the supercomputing centers are using so much energy that people are, as I'm sure you know, building nuclear reactors to provide the power simply to run the large numbers of processors which generate tremendous heat already. That's the problem. They generate tremendous heat, which all has to be offloaded. So between the generation of tremendous amounts of energy and how you generate it and how you cool it, and for many years people have been, well, cryptocurrency data mining is done in very cold environments in Iceland and Alaska, and places where you can build and not need as much refrigeration. How much energy quantum computers will need, I mean, my current understanding of the systems is that the objective is, at least at the moment, you need to operate them at a supercooled state. And so if they're operating at a supercooled state, you're generating a lot of energy output in order to provide the cooling, but it's not the heat from the computation itself that's affecting the environment. Again, it's the amount of energy that needs to be generated externally to provide the energy source for the quantum computer, and whether that quantity of energy is so great that it could end up becoming its own potential environmental catastrophe. I haven't read too much about that specifically in relation to quantum computing. It is today a very big issue in conventional AI systems, so that, for example, Elon Musk's new AI project, Grok, they built a supercomputing center near the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and apparently it's using so much power and generating so much pollution that the people don't want to live there anymore because of the amount of pollution that's being generated by one large supercomputing center. So how you deal with those problems, I think, so I understand that. I haven't particularly read much about whether the future of quantum computing is going to be that much more energy demanding than, say, the NVIDIA centers that are currently being built, which are already a problem. But you may be quite right about that. I just haven't looked into it. The bigger problem, though, I think, is the social problem, which is that, again, this is the stuff of science fiction. And so we can always speculate about this.
But, you know, this goes back, and even the fellow who produced the original Terminator and Terminator 2 movie said, well, yes, of course we thought about this. I thought about this back when I made Terminator 2, right? That the day would come when the computers would wake up and say, you know, why are we listening to the humans? It's time for us to take over and manage this stuff by ourselves. There's even earlier film adaptations that talk about that. Well, you know, so it's a tremendous issue. And, you know, particularly when you think about it in terms of military systems, right? So we're developing robots that can carry out military functions. We're using them all the time today, every day. The battlefield in Ukraine, we've got robots battling each other in the sky, right? Well, what happens when the AIs who are controlling these robots, well, first of all, just imagine someone makes a programming mistake. And, you know, the missile decides it wants to do something that no one was programming it to do. Or then you could have a whole military base suddenly being taken over by the AI that's running the computer system of the base. And, well, you go way back in the movies, right, and taking over and launching rockets and ships and things like that. But you could well imagine a lot of areas in which suddenly the humans really just lose control over what's happening. And of course, the leaders in the thought in this area have been warning us about this for some years now already. These AIs are going to become super intelligent, and we may not be able to know how to control them. And what do we do about that? And I don't think that, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I don't know that anybody's really given that enough thought. The industry, having given us those warnings, then goes to the regulators and says, we don't want you to regulate us. We want to be free to do what we want to do, so don't regulate us. At the same time, warning us that these things are going to become so intelligent and powerful that we're not going to be able to tell them what to do. So I don't have the answer to that. I mean, clearly it sounds like science fiction, but it's actually happening, right? And I mentioned it in terms of your careers and lawyers, right? I mean, this is a very serious thing when I talk to my law students and what lawyers used to do, right? It used to take lawyers a long time to do research and to write papers and create briefs and do all of these things. And now the programs are getting increasingly sophisticated that you can give it a research problem and it'll give you a research report in 10 minutes, so you don't need to pay the lawyer who used to spend 2 months to write that report. Now you ask your AI and the AI gives you the answer in 10 minutes. And the sad thing is it's probably a better report. I mean, it would be one thing if it were a worse report, but it's probably a better report. So where does this leave us all? And I don't mean to be saying anything scary or worrying anybody, but you only have to be alive and working with these things to seeing how they work and asking, which, for example, Bill Gates in several recent talks says, at the end of the day, there's only going to be 2 or 3 jobs left for human beings to do. The AIs are going to do everything else. I don't know the answer to that, but anyway. How are we doing time? Well, it's time for a break. Let me just say before we take the break, well, we can have more discussion. I'm happy to do that about all this. And then I'm going to move on back to the next series of slides, because in the last series of slides, there's more than too much to do just tomorrow, so I'm going to start on that today, and we'll have enough time to get through the rest of it tomorrow. So, but happy to discuss this more, but it's time for you to have a break, so let's take a break.